When you want to live, but others refuse to let you live, do you kneel down and wait for judgment, or do you fight to the death and flee far away in search of a single chance to survive? Without freedom, I would rather die. This is the cry from the depths of the heart of an illiterate female slave. Her name is Harriet, but decades later, her portrait would appear on the $20 bill. At the age of 20, Harriet followed her parents and served a plantation owner in the eastern region, even though her parents had signed an agreement that promised freedom at the age of 55. The white plantation owner saw their strong bodies and believed that before squeezing out the last bit of labor from the enslaved people, he had the right to decide their life or death. Those documents stamped with official seals meant nothing to white people at all. At marriageable age, Harriet fell in love with John, who was also enslaved on the plantation, but their marriage had to be approved by the owner. Out of regard for Harriet's parents, the plantation owner generously agreed to their union, but when John proposed that his future children with Harriet should be born with the status of free people, the plantation owner's expression instantly changed. Without freedom, it meant that their children would be born to live the same life, worse than that of animals. Harriet ran to the back hills in despair and broke down in tears.
My master is an evil man, Lord. You know he evil. Take him, Lord.
Unexpectedly, the young master who had grown up with her followed her there. He overheard Harriet cursing his father, and in that moment, his last trace of pity for her completely vanished. By coincidence, not long after that, the plantation owner suddenly fell gravely ill and died. At the funeral, the young master cast a look of hatred toward Harriet. He blamed his father's death entirely on Harriet's curse from 3 months earlier. Harriet understood that what awaited her next would be unimaginable revenge. At best, she would be sold away, and at worst, she would be tortured to death. After spending a night in terror, the next morning, while chopping firewood, Harriet saw the overseer walking toward her with weapons. In that instant, a bold thought rose in Harriet's mind. She had to escape, no matter whether the next second meant life or death. She was determined to risk everything. She rushed to the backyard to say goodbye to her beloved. John was deeply worried, but at that moment, Harriet had no other choice. She turned and went to the kitchen, grabbed a sharp knife from the chopping board, and then bravely ran toward the depths of the forest. When the young master discovered that Harriet was missing, he led the household servants to search everywhere. In order to buy time for his lover to escape, John deliberately sat at the end of a shaded path not far from the plantation, pretending to wait for someone.
Where is she? I told you, sir. I was just coming to see her. Kiss her good.
This one knows something. Caught him sniffing around the cabins when Minty ran off.
I told you. I ain't seen her.
Meanwhile, Harriet kept sprinting eastward without stopping for a single moment, but human legs could never outrun horses. The young master, accompanied by hunting dogs, was tracking her direction.
I'm gonna be free or die.
Those who survive great disaster are destined to carry an unfinished mission waiting for them. To avoid the young master's pursuit, Harriet did not dare to stop even after waking up. Yet her skin color made every step difficult. She avoided white people along the way and moved forward cautiously and with great difficulty. She once heard her parents speak of a man, a white blacksmith named Thomas. Thomas was one of the few white people who openly opposed racial discrimination, and countless enslaved people had received his help. At a dock, drenched from head to toe, Harriet asked around for Thomas's residence.
You know a blacksmith around here? Named McGarrett?
Careful, Mom. You half dressed. Look half dead. Anyone with eyes can see what you are. He's on the corner of 4th and Shipley. No more than half a mile west of here.
Thank you, sir.
Following the guidance of her people, Harriet successfully found Thomas the next day. After confirming his identity, the nerves that had been stretched tight for 7 days and 7 nights finally relaxed in that moment. This was the first peaceful sleep Harriet had ever had in her life. After recovering for a few days in Thomas's home, Thomas personally escorted her to the border. He told Harriet that this was all he could do for her. Crossing the border would lead to Philadelphia, where there was no trade in enslaved people, and where no one cared about the color of her skin. Thomas also pointed her toward a clear path forward. He gave Harriet information about members of the Abolitionist Society and told her to seek them out once she crossed the border. Harriet looked at the rising morning sun and stretched out her limbs. She had finally been reborn. On the third day after parting from Thomas, Harriet appeared in the bustling streets of Philadelphia. She was still timid and fearful of this unfamiliar environment. A fellow black fruit vendor told her that here, walking with her head held high was not a crime. He hoped Harriet would relax. With reassurance from one of her own people, Harriet's steps grew lighter. Before long, she found a member of the Abolitionist Society named William, just as she had hoped. At that time, very few people of color could make it this far. Most enslaved people who had lost their freedom had long been mentally imprisoned and no longer possessed any sense of resistance. Others, due to the brutality of their owners, had no space at all to escape. Harriet belonged to a very small group of the fortunate. William carefully recorded everything Harriet and her elders had experienced. Afterward, William brought Harriet to meet a great female activist named Marie. When Harriet removed her clothes to bathe, Marie saw her back covered with dense scars like coiled pythons, a mark unique to all enslaved people. 1 year later, Harriet asked a free man named Feynman, who had once helped her, to deliver a message to her parents and her lover in the eastern region. It was a message saying that she was doing well, but Feynman said he searched several times and could not find them, which immediately made Harriet worry about her family's safety. She naively believed that with William's influence, she could return east to bring her family back, but William regretfully told her that the freedom they enjoyed breathing air on Philadelphia's land had been won through the enormous sacrifices of countless people. They could not help all enslaved people, and were only struggling to defend rights and create paths forward, because they had helped too many escaped slaves. White plantation owners had already taken them to court. The abolitionist organization itself was now in a very dangerous position, thinking of her family still suffering. Freedom for one person alone could not make Harriet happy. That night, Harriet told Marie about her desire to go back and rescue her family. Marie understood that this sounded somewhat unrealistic, but changing the world required more enslaved people to stand up. She deeply admired Harriet's courage, and so she began to support Harriet through action. She disguised Harriet as a wealthy lady, taught her how to use firearms, and obtained a new identity for her. In this way, Harriet boarded a train and once again headed toward the homeland that filled her with fear. As soon as she stepped off the train, that familiar smell rushed toward her. On the platform, several exhausted-looking people of her own kind stood shackled hand and foot, with no idea where they would be sold. A white lawman walked toward her, and Harriet lifted her head high and handed over her documents. Meanwhile, Harriet's parents, who had been resold multiple times, were brought back once again to the plantation they had once known. At that time, enslaved people were not only tools for labor, but also a business through which white people profited by reselling them. During his lunch break, John had just sat down by the fence to rest when suddenly, a familiar song sounded behind him.
Wait.
Seeing the huge scar on John's face left behind because of her escape, Harriet was instantly overwhelmed with sorrow. What she found even harder to accept was that after hearing Harriet had drowned, John had already remarried. Now asking John to leave with her was simply impossible, for someone who does not want to change. Nothing you do can move him, so Harriet said goodbye to John and went to the wooden cabin where her parents lived. Her father's eyes had been cruelly gouged out by the young master a year earlier. Fortunately, her mother and brothers were still living together. At this moment, the young master was also planning to sell the entire family to pay off debts. Harriet's arrival was perfectly timed. If she had come 2 days later, they would have been scattered to different places and never seen each other again. Before long, more and more enslaved people from the plantation quietly gathered. After a brief discussion, Harriet's father decided to stay behind alone. Old and frail, he did not want to burden the young people. That night, they found a black pastor they had known for many years. The pastor hid them in the cellar, planning to lie low for 2 days before setting off. The next day at noon, the plantation mistress discovered that 5 enslaved people were missing. When the young master heard the news, he poured his rage onto the maid and her 2 young children. He ordered his servants to sell the maid's 5-year-old child. In order to protect her child, the maid had no choice but to reveal that Harriet had been there. That afternoon, a pursuit team made up of white men and 2 black hunters driven only by money began the chase. On the evening of the 3rd day, Harriet took advantage of the darkness and led her people to move out.
Good boy.
When they reached a river, those who could not swim hesitated on the bank. Harriet stepped into the river first, and her courage and fearlessness moved everyone. The young master's hunting dogs also lost the scent of the escaped people by the river. Enraged, he killed the 2 hired hunters on the spot. 7 days later, Harriet arrived in Philadelphia with her family, leaving William in disbelief. With this success, Harriet gained tremendous confidence in rescuing more of her people. Over the next 3 years, she entered different eastern plantations 13 times, carrying out legendary rescues that freed hundreds of people. Every escape, she carved out a route known only to herself. Every time, she chose a different path. Her group grew from 3 or 5 people to entire families, reaching more than 20 at its largest. Her secret gradually became public. Plantation owners in the eastern region pooled $40,000 to place a bounty on her, but Harriet showed no fear at all. She focused entirely on planning rescue routes and arranging livelihoods for those who reached Philadelphia. In the late autumn of 1852, the young master who controlled Harriet's family joined forces with the authorities and located the apartment where Marie was sheltering escaped people. They destroyed the furnishings inside and arrested Harriet's family. When they restrained Marie, she chose death rather than reveal Harriet's whereabouts.
She's gotta live long enough to do God's will. She knows that. She's smarter than you. She's smarter than you. She's smarter than you. Let me go. Let me go.
She's not here. Let's go.
While Harriet was at the docks arranging passage for her people, she was spotted by the young master who was about to board a ship. But by then, Harriet had countless followers who secretly protected her. Marie's death made Harriet realize that relying solely on brute force to win freedom could also place more people in danger. So she went to New York, the very center of power. Together with William, she entered high society and spoke everywhere about racial equality. Those in power, regardless of their true thoughts, all displayed a careless attitude in public. But this approach was slow, and the authorities failed to carry out real reforms. When Harriet learned that her parents were about to be punished in the eastern region, she could no longer sit still. She immediately set off for her hometown, joined local followers, and for the first time openly stormed the master's house. This group was no longer made up of only black people. White native landowners whose land had been seized stood firmly on Harriet's side to reclaim what was taken from them. Even children who had long been bullied raised their weapons and aimed them at the master. On this journey, Harriet gathered thousands of strong young enslaved people and formed a powerful, organized, and disciplined force. Under her command and leadership, they freed thousands of enslaved people from plantation owners and restored their freedom. They also returned the land to the hands of the native people. More and more enslaved people in the eastern region developed an intense reliance on Harriet. They took the initiative to escape and moved toward her from all directions. Those once high and mighty plantation owners were forced to yield when they faced Harriet.
Ready?
In 1863, Harriet led 3 federal gunboats up the Combahee River, carrying out a large-scale liberation of enslaved people in the eastern region. This woman, who could barely read, who suffered from trauma-related stress and lived a life of poverty, defined courage in the most primal way. She was not without fear, but she moved forward despite it. Her story tells us that change does not require vast armies. It only needs one person who refuses to kneel. In 2016, the United States Treasury announced that Harriet's image would appear on the new $20 bill. She became the first African-American woman to appear on U.S. currency. What the film presents is only Harriet's early escape and some of her initial rescue missions. Over the following 70 years, she devoted herself to women's voting rights and the fight for equality for black people, making outstanding contributions. I am a film enthusiast. Thank you for watching. See you next time.